September 16th, 1992. One man woke up, made a single bet, and by midnight had pocketed over $1 billion. The British government spent $27 billion trying to stop him. They failed. The Prime Minister found out his country had been humiliated on live television. The Chancellor of the Exchequer announced Britain's surrender from a podium, visibly shaking. And the man who did it? He was eating lunch. His name was George Soros. He didn't rob a bank. He didn't hack a system. He didn't fire a single weapon. He just read a spreadsheet better than an entire government. And that was enough. This is the story of the trade that broke a nation, made one man a legend, and proved that markets are more powerful than governments. Every single time. Budapest, 1930. A Jewish boy is born into a middle-class family in a country that is about to become one of the most dangerous places on earth. His father, Tivadar, is a lawyer and a survivor of Russian prisoner of war camps. He teaches his son one lesson above all others. Reality is negotiable. Rules are human inventions, and the people who understand this earliest survive. George Soros absorbs this completely. When the Nazis occupy Hungary in 1944, Tivadar does something extraordinary. He doesn't hide. He doesn't flee. He buys forged documents. He splits his family up. He bribes officials. He outmaneuvers a machine designed to be unmovable. And his entire family survives the Holocaust, while hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews do not. George is 14 years old, watching his father bend reality with paperwork and nerve. He never forgets it. In 1947, as Soviet communism tightens its grip on Hungary, Soros leaves. Alone. He ends up in London, broke, surviving on almost nothing, working as a railway porter, a waiter, writing letters to every banker in the city begging for a job. One finally answers. He gets a junior clerk position at a small merchant bank. It pays almost nothing. But Soros isn't there for the salary. He's there to learn the machine from the inside. By 1956, he moves to New York. By the 1960s, he's trading. By the 1970s, he's building something. In 1973, George Soros founds the Quantum Fund, a hedge fund built on a single philosophy he called reflexivity. The idea that markets aren't rational, they're emotional. They respond not just to reality, but to perception of reality. And perception can be manipulated, moved, broken. Most investors look at a market and ask, what is this worth? Soros asks something different. What does everyone else think this is worth? And how wrong are they? The gap between those two questions. That's where fortunes are made. Through the late 70s and 80s, the Quantum Fund delivers returns that make Wall Street's best look like amateurs. 30%, 40%. Years of compounding gains that turn early investors into extraordinarily wealthy people. But the biggest trade of his life hasn't happened yet. And it's going to require a continent's worth of political dysfunction to set it up. Europe has an idea. The idea is called the Exchange Rate Mechanism, the ERM. And on paper, it is elegant, simple, sensible. Here's the concept. European countries agree to lock their currencies together within tight bands. The German Deutsche Mark at the center, the anchor, the strongest currency in the room. Everyone else pegs themselves to it. If your currency drifts too far from the agreed rate, your government intervenes. You buy your own currency to push it back up. You sell it to push it back down. You hold the line. The goal is stability. No wild swings. No competitive devaluations. A smooth path toward eventual European unity. What could go wrong? Britain watches the ERM from the sidelines for a decade. Skeptical, proud, resistant. The British pound doesn't need a babysitter. Sterling has been a global reserve currency for centuries. Britain didn't fight 2 world wars to peg itself to the Deutsche Mark. But by 1990, the pressure is overwhelming. Europe is integrating. The single market is taking shape, and Britain, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who hates the idea, is dragged in anyway. In October 1990, Britain joins the ERM. The pound is pegged at 2.95 Deutsche Marks, with a permitted fluctuation band of 6%. If the pound ever drops below 2.773 Deutsche Marks, the British government is legally obligated to intervene. Buy pounds, prop up the rate, hold the line. It sounds manageable. It is not. Because almost immediately, the economics stop making sense. Britain in 1990 is struggling. Inflation is high. The economy is slowing. Unemployment is rising. The normal medicine for a sick economy is to cut interest rates, cheaper borrowing, more spending, more growth, standard playbook. But here's the trap. If Britain cuts interest rates, the pound becomes less attractive to foreign investors. Capital flows out. The pound weakens. It breaks through the floor of 2.773. Britain is forced to defend it. The ERM doesn't care that Britain's economy needs relief. It only cares about the number. So Britain keeps interest rates high, crushingly high, 10%, 12%, 15% in an economy that can barely breathe. Homeowners with variable rate mortgages are being destroyed. Businesses can't borrow. The housing market is collapsing. Britain is in a cage of its own making, and George Soros is watching. He's been watching for months, quietly, reading the data, running the numbers, talking to economists, central bankers, politicians, asking one question over and over. Can Britain actually hold this peg? The answer he keeps getting back is the same. No. By the summer of 1992, Soros is certain. The British pound is overvalued. The British economy is too weak to sustain the interest rates needed to defend it. And the ERM, for all its political importance, has no mechanism to accommodate reality. It is a fixed rule in a world that refuses to be fixed. The pound will break. The only question is when, and whether anyone is willing to push it. Soros convenes a meeting with his chief strategist, Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller has already built a position. He's been quietly shorting the pound for weeks. He believes in the trade. He tells Soros the setup is perfect. Soros looks at him and says something that becomes one of the most famous lines in financial history. If the trade is this good, why are we only doing it halfway? Go for the jugular. Druckenmiller nearly falls out of his chair. They are already betting $1.5 billion against the pound. Soros wants to go to $10 billion. $10 billion. Borrowed. Leveraged. All of it a bet that the British government will be forced to abandon its currency peg. If they're wrong, the quantum fund is finished. Everything Soros has built over 20 years, gone. If they're right, it's the greatest currency trade in history. They go to $10 billion, and they are not alone. Word spreads quietly through the hedge fund world. The trade is too obvious to keep secret. Other funds start building their own positions. Currency traders in London, New York, Frankfurt, Tokyo start leaning the same direction. It becomes a coordinated pressure campaign, without anyone coordinating it. Just a shared read of the same broken math. All of them waiting, watching, loading the spring. September 15th, 1992. Tuesday. The pound is under pressure. Currency traders are selling. The Bank of England is buying. Spending reserves. Holding the line. The British Treasury watches the numbers and issues statements of confidence. Sterling is strong. Britain is committed to the ERM. There will be no devaluation. Nobody believes them. That night, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, calls an emergency meeting. He knows what's coming. He asks for permission to raise interest rates. Emergency hikes. A dramatic signal to the markets that Britain will pay any price to defend the pound. Permission granted. September 16th, 1992. Wednesday. 7 a.m. London. The Bank of England opens for business and immediately starts buying pounds by the billion. Soros and the other funds are selling. It is a tug of war between a sovereign government and a collection of hedge funds, and the government has more money. For about an hour, by mid-morning, the Bank of England has spent over $15 billion in reserves. The pound is barely holding. Norman Lamont announces an emergency interest rate hike from 10% to 12%. The markets don't move. Lamont announces another hike from 12% to 15%. The pound keeps falling. In the history of British economic policy, this has never happened before. Interest rates raised twice in a single morning, an act of pure desperation dressed up as confidence. Soros hears the news over the wire at his office in New York. He doesn't panic. He doesn't change anything. He eats lunch. By early afternoon, London is in freefall. The selling is overwhelming. Every central bank reserve Britain throws into the fire is absorbed instantly. The math has stopped working. No amount of buying can offset the tsunami of selling. The market has decided, and the market is bigger than the government. 4:15 p.m., London. Norman Lamont walks out in front of a cluster of microphones outside the Treasury and announces that Britain is suspending its membership in the exchange rate mechanism, effective immediately. He looks like a man who has just watched his house burn down. The pound drops 15% against the Deutsche Mark within hours. September 16th, 1992, becomes known forever as Black Wednesday, or if you ask the people who made money, as Golden Wednesday. By the time the markets close, George Soros has made $1.1 billion in a single day. One day, one trade, $1 billion. In the days and weeks that follow, as the full position unwinds, the total profit climbs past $1.5 billion. Some estimates put it higher. It is the single largest currency trade profit in history. Soros doesn't gloat publicly. Not immediately. He gives a brief interview. He says the ERM was an inherently flawed system. He says he didn't cause the crisis, he simply recognized it. He says a government cannot indefinitely maintain a currency peg that the underlying economy cannot support. He is technically correct. Britain's economy, freed from the stranglehold of artificially high interest rates, begins to recover almost immediately. Interest rates fall. The housing market stabilizes. GDP starts growing. The devaluation that looked like a national humiliation turns out to be the medicine the economy desperately needed. By the mid-1990s, Britain is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. The countries that stayed in the ERM are struggling. History is cruel that way, but the political damage is catastrophic. The Conservative Party, in power for 13 years, never recovers. Their reputation for economic competence, their single greatest asset, is destroyed in a single afternoon. 5 years later, they are swept out of office in one of the most decisive electoral defeats in British political history. All of it traceable back to that Wednesday afternoon, that podium, Norman Lamont's face, and one man eating lunch in New York. George Soros becomes the most famous speculator in the world overnight. He becomes a bogeyman for governments, a hero for traders, a philosopher for markets. He writes books. He funds democracy movements across Eastern Europe. He builds one of the largest private philanthropic networks in history, the Open Society Foundations. Billions donated to civil liberties, education, human rights. He is simultaneously the man who broke a nation and the man who bankrolled freedom movements across a continent. Complex doesn't begin to cover it. But the trade itself, Black Wednesday, leaves something behind that no amount of philanthropy fully erases. It proves something governments didn't want proven, that a single private individual with enough conviction, enough capital, and enough patience can overwhelm a sovereign government's economic policy. That markets are not referees, they are players. And sometimes they are the biggest player in the room. Every central bank in the world rewrites its crisis playbook after 1992. Every hedge fund starts looking for the next overvalued currency peg. Because Soros didn't just make $1 billion. He published a blueprint. And the next crisis, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Russian default of 1998, the Eurozone crisis of 2010, each one traces a line back to this moment. This trade, this proof of concept, that governments lie about what their economies can bear, that markets eventually force the truth, and that somewhere, always, someone is reading the spreadsheet more carefully than everyone else. Soros was asked years later if he felt any guilt about Black Wednesday, about the British families whose mortgages spiked, the businesses that closed, the government that fell. He paused. Then he said, "I didn't create the problem. I identified it." Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone has ever said about money. Or maybe it's the most dangerous. Because the next George Soros is already out there right now, reading a spreadsheet, finding the gap between what a government says its economy is worth and what the market knows it's actually worth. And somewhere, a government is standing at a podium insisting everything is fine.